Welcome to the Crescendo Conference, On the Road Again. I am Evelyn Johnson, resident of Chicago, and with me today to share with all of you is Alan Forsman, resident of Sarasota, Florida. Alan and I, along with Debbie Blue, helped with the launching of Crescendo Ministries, focused on the 60-plus age group in 2016. Ellen and I continue to serve as co-leaders of the leadership team today. Our theme, On the Road Again, points us to the whole process after the intense COVID season of re-entering and re-engaging. Re-engaging in purposeful, missional living. The on-ramps that we're going to explore today include investing in younger generations, including then creating legacy stories, as well as naming and processing losses. We'd want to thank everyone that's been a part of creating this. And I turn to you, Alan, and just ask, set the stage for us.
All right. I love to travel, but being on the road again means that you need to have a plan. You need to have a map, because sometimes GPS doesn't even do us well. And I think that we experience some dead ends and some detours along the way. But in order for us to be able to overcome that, we know where our end result has to be. We have to be creative. We have to be flexible. We have to be tenacious. Someone has said in a recent book, do not go only where the path may lead, but create a new trail and blaze it as you go into the future. One of the things that's happened coming out of this whole pandemic is what's called comfortable confinement. Sociologists and psychologists are studying people's behavior, and even people who have been very gregarious are reticent to get fully re-engaged. And it's important for us to recognize that things will never be the way they were, but we can have a hand in creating something new. Recreating Crescendo community is really going to be a very important part of our future, because community, which is facilitated by good communication, talks about holding things in common. And loneliness and isolation have been a huge issue, not only for 60-plus people. A lot of evidence that the younger generations, particularly the millennials, are suffering from the same thing. So what better place than the church to re-engage and connect people at all levels, but especially focusing on the possibilities for our 60-plus community, because there's tremendous opportunity for discipleship. So as we think about that, church being a wonderful place for re-engagement, there are 5 real things that the Bible speaks about that will really help us think about the significance of community. Community is encouraging. I'm not going to read these scriptures, but you have time to take note of them. Community is enjoyable. Community can be energizing. And a key thing is engaging. But also community, especially in scripture, talks about community being essential. God has created the church to be a focal point of leading people to Christ and building people up in the faith through discipleship and participating in ministries of compassion, mercy, and justice. A key component of this for our 60-plus and our Crescendo emphasis is an acrostic we call spices. And we're showing spices now with community as the hub, because out of that can flow all of these other things. We have the possibility for greater spiritual depth, that discipleship component that's so important, a sense of physical well-being, intellectual stimulation to keep our minds alert and alive, that emotional support that's so important, which we read about in Romans, as well as service opportunities, because as long as we have life and breath, God has something for us to do. So vital, purposeful living is possible because we have a God that offers hope. That makes it possible for us to have this courage for re-engaging, because as we read in Isaiah and in Revelation, God is making all things new. May the God of hope stimulate our thinking during this session. Let's be spurred on to action as we create new on-ramps for our own hopeful living and for those 60 plus people in our circle of influence. Please join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for another day. This is the day that you have made. May we rejoice and be glad in it. May we be inspired to move ahead in more ways to honor you, glorify you in what we do, and to meet the needs of those with whom we come in contact. We give you thanks for this time and ask your added blessing in Jesus' name. Amen.
Our first on-ramp today is investing in younger generations. We're going to turn now to Linda Delgado, who will introduce, and after that, we'll be able to explore with some people some possibilities.
As our population crescendos with an ever-increasing number of people over 60, we find that by age 65, 96% of Americans are grandparents. Statistics show that we are living in a grandparenting social phenomena. We have more great-grandparents than ever before, and we have more four-generation families than ever before. With increased longevity, we find ourselves balancing our lives between the older and the younger generations. Grandparenting and great-grandparenting relationships may take on unexpected roles of caregiving, but also an increased opportunity, that of providing a moral compass, emotional and social support, as well as opportunities to pass on the faith, as Timothy's grandmother Lois did. Our churches are gifted with those that are over 60 who have lived and gained wisdom in life, who can see the potential in that young child or teenager or young adult, and can come alongside to mentor, encourage, or inspire. Today, we will look at 3 examples of intergenerational relationships that are being nurtured. Thank you for joining me today.
So, what are you two mixing up today?
What are we making today, bud?
Cookies.
What kind of cookies?
Chocolate chip.
We're going to fill that all the way. We want it to get all the way up to the top without smashing it down. We need a little bit more in there.
I already got it.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Just
Got it, Alma.
I'm going to add that much more. Will you put that in the bowl, please? Thanks, buddy. Okay, we're going to need another one of those. But it needs to be filled up.
I can do it.
Maybe I'll just fill it
This
more.
food can get gone.
All right, now we're done with the big one because we needed 2 full-size cups. Now we need 2 quarter cups to make a half a
And
cup.
I'll do it.
Alrighty. And then we need 1 more of those. Our goal is not to, we're gonna get rid of some of that. There we go. Thank you.
I just did a big lump.
So that, okay, so
Can you wash my hands? Yes.
yes, did we get the eggs?
Yes.
What about the vanilla?
Yes.
Did we get 2 teaspoons of vanilla?
Yes.
Okay. What about the butter? Did we get both sticks of butter in there?
Yes.
And then pretty soon we're going to put in the chocolate chips.
Just one little teeny bit. In
Can you pour the rest of them here, please? And we get one more. And you've had enough for right now. So all of these need to go into the bowl, please. Before we put this pan of cookies into the oven,
flatten them
and how are we going to do that?
with our hands.
With the heel of our hand, you're right. This is the last one for this pan. You're getting one ready for the next pan. All right, let's move
Now
the
let's
cookie dough
flatten
over.
them.
Okay, you're gonna work on that side. That looks great, buddy. One good press.
All right, time to test.
What do you think, bud?
Good.
Gordon, it is so good to be able to meet you and have this time to talk with you and find out about your experience with grandparenting. Would like you, if you don't mind, tell us your name and where you're living, a little bit about you, and the number and ages of your grandchildren.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm Gordon Moan. I'm a retired school administrator. When we retired, we moved from McPherson, Kansas to Citrus County, Florida, for live our retired life. But while I was at Countryside in McPherson, we taught several classes and had several studies, many of them involving or focusing on grandparenting and life after retirement. We have 11 grandchildren. We have 10 that are our children's children, and one that's an in-law. So it tells you that our oldest granddaughter is 24, and our youngest grandchild is a little girl who's 7.
I am curious to know when you went through that, what were the highlights? What was surprising to you, and what how that helped you with your grandchildren and as a grandparent?
One of the first things that we realized in the whole coursework and that whole experience of learning and taking a biblical perspective to grandparenting, that our audience will have a variety of experiences, a variety of situations, from as fortunate as we are to have children of faith, raising our grandchildren, to families that are fractured, families that don't have any connection to the church or to the faith anymore. Living situations. At one time, 4 of our grandchildren lived across the alley from us.
Oh, wow.
That time of that relationship was a lot different than it is now when they're in Chicago. I think this whole third calling thing fits well with the grandparenting experience. You know, the third calling would tell you that after retirement, we just don't go to Leisureville, but that ties so close then in that time that you have available after retirement to try to change your focus or emphasize your relationship with your grandchildren and your children. So that's been interesting too, and that we've been able to spend really more time with our family because we're free enough to travel and to be able to do that. So that's been one of the surprises that I've had in fact, I always felt a little guilty moving to the retirement community in Florida for retirement. And what Vicki and I said over and over is, we can't let this become Leisureville.
Right.
This has to be a way that we continue to be engaged. One of the other things that we learned was that our priority should continue to be parenting before grandparenting.
Oh, that's interesting.
We have an obligation to continue to mentor our children, to be parents, to build that relationship. And if you don't have a healthy relationship with your children, it creates a lot of challenges in being a grandparent. And so we really have to focus on continuing to build a relationship with our children and allow that to flow into the relationship with our grandchildren. Now, the reality tells you that sometimes that's just impossible. And so the answer can't be, if I don't have a relationship with my children, I can't have a relationship with my grandchildren. And we didn't have answers for that, but there's got to be a way in families that are challenged, broken, families that don't share the faith, that we can come beside them as grandparents and walk that very delicate line. That was enlightening to us. And
Can I pursue that before
Sure.
you go on to the
Yeah.
next?
Yeah.
You said several times, build relationships, and with your children and also with your grandchildren. What would be the key to building a relationship? Especially, I'm thinking of you. You have your children now long distance. How would you advise us? Would be the key points in building a relationship?
well, one of the things we've learned in phone conversations with our children is that we need to do more listening than talking. Uh, it's easy to tell them about all of our experiences. And right now we're in this new experience of retirement. So we have a lot of stories to tell.
Sure.
They don't really need to hear all that. We need to take time and let them talk and listen to them and prompt them and encourage them to have conversations with us. Our younger granddaughters in Alaska love to call us and love to talk.
Mhm.
So we've got that kind of relationship with them that's it's not unusual. Almost every day one of them will call and just want to talk. And then we have college age grandkids, our married granddaughter who are so busy we seldom get to talk to them. So there's just a variety of situations that you have to live through.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Those are really good tips. How would you recommend, what words of encouragement would you give to others that are investing in the younger generation? And I don't know if you, in your group, if you had people that did not have their own biological grandchildren, maybe they were mentors to young children. I know we did in ours, and I'm curious to know if you did.
Yes, we did. We had a variety of relationships. We had some parents or some grandparents who were actually doing the parenting. Maybe even the children lived in their home with them.
Mhm.
So that becomes, once that's your situation, you can forget about the grandparenting skills. You need parenting skills.
Right.
We had several couples who had adopted families. They didn't have any families in our community, and they created that grandparent role for people. I think it's important that you pray. You pray about, give me the insight, Father. Show my wife, reveal to us how we should respond to these, to pray for our grandchildren and our children, and to let them know we pray for them. Make that obvious to them. And we just have to persevere. We can't become discouraged. I think we need to be willing to do that and admit that I've never been a grandparent before. I'm not sure how to do this. Sometimes it's an experiment. And remember that your parents are looking up, or your children are looking up to you, expecting you to have all the answers in an experience that you've never had before.
Right.
So we have to admit that many times it's trial and error. But if we allow Christ to be in our heart, those trials, those attempts are going to be led by the wisdom that he provides us, and makes all the difference in the world. I think it's important to seek advice. Be in a small group. Be in some kind of discussion with other parents and grandparents about their lives. Learn from them. Be able to share your celebrations and your tribulations with them.
That's all so much. I think this is
Thank
very,
you.
very encouraging. It's an amazing time that in today's demographics, that there are families that can see 4 generations at one time. And so an impact a grandparent has is a tremendous impact.
Think about the young people in your sphere of influence. Who is it that you're coming in contact with at least fairly regularly? Could be grandchildren, but could also be children, youth, young adults in your neighborhood, in your community at large. How are you investing in at least one or more within the younger generation? So we're going to turn to Linda Delgado, who's going to introduce us to the next portion related to investing in younger generations. Linda?
Welcome back. You've heard various ideas for what you might do personally and sharing, and some wonderful comments. And I think with your discussions as well. Let us think for a moment about what your church or particular your community might do to invest in the lives of younger generation. In the following photos and videos, you'll see a great intergenerational connection that took place when the youth group from Hope Covenant Church in Chandler, Arizona, came to San Diego for a work trip at Grace Community Church. The youth from these churches visited us, the residents at Covenant Living at Mount Miguel. You can go ahead and show those pictures. I'll finish this. For a time of getting to know each other and hear their stories and pray together. The photos were taken during the visit, and the video interviews of the youth and seniors were taken 1 year later. So it'll be interesting to see their comments. You're seeing in these pictures how they are engaged, and it was a fabulous interaction where they got to know each other and pray for each other and hear stories. And this is the Covenant Living and the youth group from the churches.
Okay, so I know it's been a whole entire year since we were in San Diego, but we really wanted to talk a little bit about what you remember most about the meeting you had with the senior residents at Covenant Living at Mount Miguel. So first of all, how was that experience? Was it a good experience?
Yes, it was pretty good.
Yeah. Is there anything that just made it really good that you can think of right now?
I was able to get good wisdom from the senior resident.
That's awesome. So they gave you some wisdom for your life. That is very cool. One more question, but think about this. I know we all have impressions of people. How did your impression of an old person, I'm putting that in quotes, change after this experience, if it did change? That's okay.
My impression on an old person didn't change because I always thought that an old person have more experience than the younger ones.
Today, I'd like to introduce you to Jay and Jackie Hobson. And they're some very special people that I've met here at Mount Miguel. And they were with our young people in Chandler last summer and made quite an impact on the young people there as you prayed for them. I have a question I want you to share with me on that experience, how important it is for young people to get to know older people.
for young people to get to know us.
Mhm.
Maybe that we still have humor and we're interested in them and in other things about us. We're not just old and sitting around. We do a lot of things.
I agree with
Very active.
you. I think that's great. What about you,
Yeah,
Jay?
still have things in common.
Oh,
Yeah. We had parents, they have parents. We have friends, they have friends. And how you relate to parents and friends. And in their group, they were an enthusiastic group. We used to be an enthusiastic group.
there you go.
Yeah.
We dealt with a lot of young people in our younger years in Placerville up in above Sacramento. We're very active with youth groups. We took them on camping, and so we love young people. They're
That's
fun.
wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I remember hearing a conversation you had with one of the young people, and you gave them a lesson that you learned in your life about how to interact with other people. And that impressed me. And they were just all ears watching you and listening to you. And it made a difference that you prayed for them. And I think that would be important. Would you encourage others to do the same?
Yeah. I think one of the things that probably is important is to develop an interest in being able to ask people. Too often we tell, but we don't ask. And that's important growing up, I think. That you're more available to find out about other people than you are to tell them about yourself. And I think that's important.
Very good advice.
Well, we have grandchildren, so it was a special time for us to be around young people.
Oh, that's
Consider
cool.
them
Yeah.
grandchildren.
Great. Thank you so much for answering my questions and sharing with everyone else today.
Oh, our pleasure.
Communities and individuals thrive when all generations are embraced and engaged. Our elders give us a mature historical perspective of who we are, where we came from, and how we got there, while our young people give us youth, vision of the future, and all that can be. Intergenerational connections bridge these vantage points and create a strong sense of community and appreciation for each other. We reap many benefits from these connections. Relationships become stronger and barriers to interaction disappear. Problems within families and communities can be addressed together or even avoided. Youth, elders, and all generations gain value, respect, self-worth, and confidence, understanding and caring for one another. Here are two ideas you can incorporate in your church services to encourage these connections. During the Sunday morning greeting time, perhaps you can have them look for each other. A person under 29 to meet with someone over 60 and get to know each other. During baby dedications, grandparents and adults that are part of that child's life can be brought into the ceremony and be blessing the child. Or maybe a work project. There's an example in our church, a work project of sanding or painting a piece of furniture together for the youth group room. And that grows relationships is all. You can get these tips and ideas to build intergenerational relationships in your church, community, or family. You can request these tips, or you can also download the Crescendo guide, study guide for grandparents and for grandparenting. And this is great for grandparents and anyone else that has an impact or an influence in a child's life, especially if they don't have an adult or a grandparent. We can help each other out. The other guide that's very, very helpful is the mentoring guide. The small group mentoring guide, mentoring can be natural, but this guide can really help to know how to be intentional and give ideas for mentoring someone as they go along. Another great way is telling stories, legacy stories. And this introduces us to the next section with Dr. Steve Wong from San Jose, California. He is a Crescendo resource specialist and will guide us and give us some great insight into legacy stories. Take it away, Steve.
All right. Thanks a lot, Linda. Appreciate that. And thanks for introducing some of those great Crescendo resources to us. I'm going to be talking about legacy stories. This is an important way of investing in younger generations. And I'm doing this live. I don't have a video, so I know this is scaring our producers a lot. I've got some dogs back there and some lawnmowers that may get started. I hope not. But anyway, I want to start by talking about the notion of legacy. A legacy is something that's handed down from the past. It's our heritage. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide. These are contained in stories. I mean, we all have our own stories, but those stories have a context that give the stories even deeper meaning. So the context of our stories is the stories of those who went before us. The more I know about the stories of my parents and their parents, the more significance it gives to my own stories, the stories that I'm going to be telling to my kids, my nephews, nieces, other young people that I know. So as a way of illustrating legacy stories, I'm going to tell you a bit about the context of my story. In other words, I'm going to tell you about my parents' stories. That's why I couldn't do this in a video, because my parents are gone. No, that's just an excuse. All right, but let me tell you about some of the context of this. I recently saw the movie Chinatown Rising. I've got a slide for this. Yeah. Oh, Ryan's right on top of things there. And Chinatown Rising, I saw this at a private screening at Cameron House in Chinatown. Now, you may not know about Cameron House, but you may know their basketball court. If you've watched the movie Sister Act or The Pursuit of Happiness, or you've seen the Muscle Milk commercial with Steph Curry, I've got some shots of that there. This is, and then I was also on the court as well with some of my friends after we saw the movie Chinatown Rising. Now, Cameron House is named after Donaldina Cameron. She was an activist of the early 20th century who worked as a foreign missionary, for the Presbyterian denomination in San Francisco, Chinatown. That's a whole story in itself. But Chinatown Rising describes the work of Reverend Harry Chuck to advocate for better conditions for the residents of Chinatown in the 60s and 70s. He was the director of youth programs at Cameron House. And the reason why this was significant to me is that as I was watching that movie right there in Cameron House, I saw a Chinatown that looked really familiar to me. Now, why is that? Okay, so let me share about my parents. My parents met in Chinatown. My dad was a pastor in a Chinatown church. He wanted to reach Chinese youth with the gospel, so he went to Chinatown, even though he had lost his ability to speak Chinese. Now, he did regain his Chinese language ability by living and working in Chinatown. Now, let me show you a picture of my mom. She's a CEF missionary. There she is in the middle. CEF means Child Evangelism Fellowship. She had come to Chinatown because the director of CEF back in St. Louis, Missouri, had said that someone needed to evangelize Chinese kids. Now, my mom grew up in Sacramento. She was the granddaughter of a Chinese railroad worker. Although women at that time were not encouraged to go to college, she graduated from Multnomah School of the Bible with a bachelor's degree and then moved to Chinatown without any financial support. This totally scares me when I think about it. But she lived in a rooming house for young Chinese women, located across the street from the church where my dad worked. Okay, the rest is history. My parents married, and then lived in an apartment a few blocks uphill on Clay Street. And if you know San Francisco Chinatown, when I say uphill, it's uphill. All right. Later, they moved to the Glen Park neighborhood. That's where I grew up. But my mom kept going back to Chinatown because she wanted to help people there. I remember one time me and my brother Phil, this was probably when I was in college, went back to Chinatown to, this small, filthy apartment. There was an old man there who, sorry for those of you who are offended by the word old, but, an elderly man who was barely mobile. And we helped throw out a filthy mattress from his room there because nobody else could help him to do that. When I look back on incidents like that and thinking about my mom returning to Chinatown, I wonder, what was my mom's experience like living in Chinatown as a single young Chinese woman? What did she know about living conditions in Chinatown that compelled her to return to help people that she knew were continuing to live in squalid conditions? Now, my dad's story is a bit different. My dad was 11, here's a picture of him, when he immigrated to the US. This is his actual passport picture. Part of his experience was to be detained on Angel Island for 2 months. Angel Island Immigration Station, they reopened this in mid-February of 2009. They had a complete renovation of it, a restoration project that cost $60 million. That started in 2005. After the first part of that was finished, and they reopened the station. And my family went there in May of 2009. Now, we had a bunch of kids with us, so we didn't take the docent-led tour because that took a couple hours. We didn't think little kids, my nieces and nephews could handle that. So we happened to be in the room, which was like a bunkhouse where the beds were, and a tour came through, and the docent noticed my dad and asked if he knew anything about Angel Island. And he mentioned that he'd been there for 2 months, and she got really excited and she wanted to know all about what that was like. He would not share his experiences. He just smiled and said, "No, thank you." And I often wonder about that. What was it that compelled my dad to return to San Francisco? He had been living in Portland with his uncle, to return to San Francisco to evangelize Chinese young people. My parents, of course, would say, well, they were called by God. But why did God call them? What was it about them that made them suitable for that kind of a calling? I mean, if you look at the next photo, I went to church in Chinatown for the first 8 years of my life. I don't remember much about the first 3 years. Nobody does, right? I mean, I do have this one small memory of getting onto a cable car with my mom, probably on Clay Street or California or something. That's all I remember. The later years, when I was living in Glen Park, then I remember driving into Chinatown, looking for parking. Like, it was not as bad as it is now. But the question I never asked myself was, why was there a Chinatown? Why were the housing conditions so poor? What was it that compelled my parents to serve God in Chinatown, to reach Chinese there? And what's revealed by my parents' stories, by the stories told in the movie Chinatown Rising through the movie camera of Reverend Harry Chuck, that's a whole nother story. You got to watch the movie, and it's going to be shown this month. Here's a plug for the movie. On a lot of PBS stations as a part of the series America Reframed. But that movie got me thinking about Chinatown, about my parents' stories, and about the importance of stories. So let's go on to this. Now let's think about the importance of stories. What are stories? And Linda mentioned several things that are important about stories, but I want to kind of dig into stories a little more. And I'm going to use the metaphor of an iceberg. Stories are like cultural artifacts. They are the actions that are at the top of the iceberg, the things that we can all see very easily. And what we see on the surface are a lot of familiar cultural expressions, food, traditions, language. I always go to those because those are the easiest ones, right? And then those things, those cultural artifacts of food, traditions, language, they color our stories. They make our stories interesting, right? I love travel shows. I love cooking shows that explore other cuisines. I don't know if you could consider chocolate chip cookies a kind of cuisine, but they tell you something about, you know, how people do cooking. And so I appreciate Sudie making that video for us. I enjoy traveling to other countries, but we have to become more than just tourists or traveling and cooking show aficionados to really learn about these other cultures. What we need to do is become archaeologists that start digging below the surface. Archaeologists try to understand a group of people by examining the cultural artifacts at the top, the easily seen things, to understand the underlying things, that attitudes that's kind of on the surface, you know, like, oh, you know, British people are reserved, and, you know, people from California are real friendly, you know, but people from New York, they'll actually help you do something. That's what I've heard. That's just attitudes. That's kind of barely on the surface. But if we start to dig a little deeper, what we start to learn about are the underlying values and beliefs, values, the rules for success, the rules for life that a group of people form. And then even deeper than that, what are the chosen truths about the world and about themselves and about God that underlie and create those rules and that start to be seen in the attitudes and then start coming out in these actions? The reason that parents and grandparents want the succeeding generations to learn about food and customs and language, and like we saw in the video, you know, praying with kids, I thought that was great, is because the parents and grandparents are hoping to pass on values and beliefs. Those are the deeper things underneath. The cultural artifacts, those are just a wrapping for these deeper values and beliefs. So what are the values and beliefs that your parents and grandparents wanted to pass on to you? That's why they're telling you these stories. That's why they're showing you how to do things. What is it that you want to pass on then to succeeding generations? So what I want to do now is we're going to take 10 minutes in the breakout groups and consider these questions. What do you wish you had asked your parents if your parents are gone? Or what do you feel like you need to ask now? Maybe sharing some of my parents' story has helped you to understand, oh yeah, there's some questions that I would like to know about, because those things are going to help cover our parents' values and rules for life and their chosen truths. And then what is it that you want to pass on? You know, just like those residents of Mount Miguel with the youth from Chandler, and, you know, praying with them and talking about their past. What are the values and rules for life and core truths that you want to pass on to the next generation? And, you know, legacy stories are more than just nostalgia. They're not stories for stories' sake. They're the wrapping paper for the core values and beliefs that define a group of people. We might think of this in terms of ethnic groups, but you could think about it in terms of your own family or whatever your group, you know, your family particularly identifies with. Or if we want to switch metaphors a little bit, we're on the road again. Legacy stories are maps for young travelers that are made by people who've already traveled the road. They show the younger travelers how to navigate the terrain and what previous travelers have discovered. Now, why do we do this? Why do we engage in storytelling? So I want to speak briefly about why this can be beneficial for storytellers. And I'm going to go to the thinking of Erik Erikson, if you're familiar with psychosocial development or emotional development. And he describes 8 stages. And I'm going to show you some things just from the latter 4 stages and the last 2 stages in particular. Stage 7 is characterized by what he calls generativity. And then the virtue of this stage is a virtue of care. Now, generativity, okay, that's a long word that you can use to impress your friends, but generativity simply has to do with creating or reproducing. We're not duplicating. We don't want, automatons, exact duplicates of who we are, but we are reproducing. When we reproduce kids, they're not exactly like us, not an exact copy, but there's a lot of similarities. And the world is changing, and so we don't need exact copies. So storytelling requires a kind of creativity to fit the changing world and the changing audience that we have, so that the core values and truths can be passed on. So what the cultural artifacts do is to give color and human interest, but we're not trying to get our kids to exactly duplicate our stories. If we do, then they call it a lecture, I suppose, instead of a story. But what we want to pass on are our values and beliefs. So as we, let's go back. I'm going to stick on this slide for a sec, Ryan. As we develop our storytelling skills, we exercise generativity and learn to care for others. I tell my kids that becoming an adult means learning to be responsible for yourself and to care for others. Or if you're a fan of Stephen Dubner, he ends his podcast with, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else. And that's what a good legacy story does. It cares for someone else. Now, stage 8, the last stage, is characterized by integrity, and the virtue is wisdom. So as we figure out life, we give life integrity, we fit all the pieces together, and then we pass on that wisdom to others. We don't do it just for wisdom's sake. It's really for the welfare of other people. It's not like these are pearls of wisdom that are just kind of floating out in the ether, but we do it because we love the next generation. We've learned to care for them. And then that developing care results in these stories that pass on wisdom, that pass on the understanding of the integrity of life. So legacy storytelling is a way for us even to, as a storyteller, to figure out more about life, to how the different components of our lives fit together. And that's what a good storyteller does, isn't it? I mean, the good storyteller chooses what to tell so that the resulting story has a satisfying narrative. It's not just a bunch of random events patched together. So it's a skill. And you may not know what stories to tell or what events to include at first, but the more you do it, the better you're going to become at it. So now let's go to the final slide, because I want to say a final thing. I mean, this is just a kind of recap of what I've been talking about, but it includes one other thing, which is the idea of blessing the younger generation. There's a lot of younger people who don't receive this sense of care or wisdom from their elders. Maybe their elders don't know how to pass on legacy stories. Your stories can give a sense of care and wisdom that they may have lacked. I once borrowed my Uncle Roy's cabin near Lake Tahoe for a prayer retreat for several days. And on the last day of that time, he knew that I was supposed to come down and give him the key, return the key to him. He lived in Davis. And he surprised me by driving up to the cabin with a pot of winter melon soup. Now, if you're Chinese, maybe you understand what winter melon soup is. Delicious stuff, right? But then he sat down with me at the table and shared with me stories about growing up in Sacramento, stories that I didn't even hear from my mom. And I learned about the oppression that the Chinese faced. And I also learned about the value of family and of standing up for each other. So I encourage you to become a legacy storyteller. Consider the values and beliefs that you want to pass on, how the events of your life can convey these values and beliefs to the next generation. Could be your kids, your nephews, your nieces, kids in a young youth group, whatever it is. And like my Uncle Roy, it doesn't hurt to cook for your audience. If you're not a great cook, don't worry about that. All right. So let's turn the time back over to Evelyn. She's going to introduce our next segment on naming and processing losses.
Investing in younger generations, creating legacy stories. These are entry points for re-entering that really require for us to bring our best emotionally healthy self. Naming and processing losses is an important step in that process of becoming emotionally healthy, which relates to our spiritual health, our engagement in community, service, intellectual well-being, and the whole of the process of physical is so connected to it all. During this next segment, we are going to hear from two colleagues, Reverend Debbie Blue and Reverend Dick Scarr, as they reflect on losses in recent years and what's been helpful to them in processing those losses. So Debbie, I just invite you to describe for us some of those losses in recent years, but particularly during this COVID time.
Actually, it's hard to land on when it really started. With the pandemic itself, the loss of community, being with community was huge. And being isolated as a single person and not having even family that you could connect with early on in the pandemic was very hard. So the adjustment of the virtual community with family was being made. And I think my oldest sister, I think what was the most stunning loss, the hardest loss, was we were preparing a virtual birthday party for my oldest sister's 75th birthday. And the night before the party was to happen, and we had done some things to get her excited and celebrate her with videos sent by a variety of people and unexpected guests for her on the virtual platform. And the night before this celebration, before her birthday, she went into the hospital for COVID. And of course, the party never happened, but she never came back home from that. So that was just an incredible loss that I still process on a almost daily basis because she's so missed. Yeah, we had a special bond, a special relationship. And the feelings that come with such a loss, unexpected loss, and the fact that she died alone. She's in Texas and no one could be there with her. I struggle with that constantly. My own feelings of should I have just taken the chance and gone to be with her or whatever. It was early in the COVID times when no vaccine was available at that point. So it's that loss covers all of the other losses of community and relationships, and it seems to have kind of snowballed, accelerated the losses of dear friends in the church and parents of friends, and it's a loss even last week of a second cousin. So my cousin's son, that was a homicide victim. Yeah, the losses just compounded. performing funerals for dear pillars of faith from my church that we still had not begun to gather. So the losses have been many. And then, of course, the racial issues that were intertwined in all of this, beginning with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And it's just, in a word, been overwhelming.
What have you found most helpful to you in processing those losses? I mean, what's kept you going?
Great question, Evelyn. Yeah, I had to process the anger first. And that was a hard one to get past. I think for whatever reason, I don't know if someone suggested this or I was seeking resources, but I found a poem by Rumi called The Guest House. Now, that to me was a way of helping me name the depth of the grief and knowing that it was not going away. But I also read something that talked about grief is like an unwelcome visitor that knocks on your door, has a suitcase, just comes in, not invited, and takes over and plans to stay as long as it wants. And how do I accommodate that? So I began to recognize that I had to call grief for what it was, that it was here and it was going to come at unexpected times. And how could I create an environment that I could befriend my grief and invite it to come in and let's sit down and have a cup of tea. And so it was not something that I wanted to keep coming back, but it was going to be there. So, hey, let's sit down and process this together. But I also have to say, and having people in your life that can help you walk alongside, that's not telling you that it's going to be okay, that's not telling you that you'll get over this, hasn't it been long enough now, but to just be present with you. And I have to say, Evelyn Johnson was one of those main persons who shared the journey with me, just to know that I had someone who was there, who was praying, who was walking alongside. If I needed to pick up the phone and scream, she could answer the phone and just listen to that scream. And there were others as well that it just let me know that they were there with me. But one particular thing that happened is I was asked to do something for my church community virtually on grief. That we had not really done anything to provide care and comfort, and people were dying in the church. People were losing family members in the church. And so I thought, I'm in a place where I can't really do that. But what I discovered was that it was a way for me to process my own grief together in community on a virtual platform. It was a very powerful experience for all of us, I believe. And it was a 4-session series that we did. And I thought, okay, I'm leading this. I can tell them what to do. And then next time we meet, let them process that together. And I thought, I gave them an assignment. And I wasn't going to do it, but I thought I should do this. I should be a part of the community and do this as well. And it was based on a book, The ABCs of Grief. And so I assigned them the task of writing out their ABCs of grief. And when I actually began to do that, I realized I was still a person in process. It was a very difficult assignment to get through. And I got stuck on A. And so I kept going back to it and going back to it. And I finally got through to Z. But as we gathered again, it ended up being pretty much the same for all of us. So I recognize that I can't lead where I won't go, and I can't teach what I don't know. And so that to me was saying, okay, you are not above this, you are in this with the community. And so let's walk together in this journey. So we finally, we had a final service a couple of weeks ago, a celebration of remembrance. And it brought the sessions, all that we did, the work that we did over these 4 sessions together in a way that we could celebrate, and still virtually, but it was amazing. We're still hearing from people how much they valued that experience, and for me as well. So other books, there's a book I read, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, by Megan Devine, and the ABCs of Grief, and different online resources that I discovered. So it's still a work in progress, but I'm in a better place than I was. And again, I can invite grief in when it happens to come, and we sit down and we work together through it.
Thank you, Debbie.
Dick, I know that over the last few years, you've experienced a series of losses. Would you be willing to share a couple of those with us?
Sure. I've experienced the usual losses for a person my age. I've lost both parents. All my aunts and uncles from both sides of my family are all gone. I've lost cousins. A brother is gone. And so I've experienced all those things there, but that's the usual losses that come with life. What I'm experiencing more recently, though, is a realization that I lost, that my world is gone. The world I grew up in is totally different from the world I'm living in now.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of makes you disoriented in a sense. I remember watching an old Western movie one time of a cowboy who lived to the time when the automobiles came into existence. He said, "My world is gone. I don't know what to do." That kind of says something of where I'm at. The world I grew up in is so different from the world I see today around me. One example, I remember watching the elections in the 1950s between Kennedy and between Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. And the worst they could talk about was for Adlai Stevenson when they called him an egghead. It means something. He was too intellectual to be a president.
Right.
But what I hear today is so much different. I hear people calling, they're throwing words like he's a liar. Well, just terrible things like that. Things I wouldn't have heard in the 50s, I'm hearing now. Loss of civility and respect in society. That's a big change for me.
It really is. And that's really good insight. So we need to learn how to process all of that stuff. Well, any other kinds of personal losses that you've experienced?
I'm experiencing some physical losses. I'm losing my ability to walk because I've got a problem with my backbone, pitching off my nerves. I'm going to have surgery in about a month or so, but it's still it's painful now to walk. So I've been in the house for about 2 or 3 months, getting out periodically every so often I can walk, but that's about it. I get to church on Sunday and Wednesday, and that's about it.
Okay. Well, tell us, how are you processing all of these losses? What resources are available to you to help work through all of these things?
I'm still processing all that stuff. I'm still kind of working through it mentally and emotionally, getting through these things. one thing a couple of things come to mind. One is in the scriptures. I read Habakkuk. He talks about, I can paraphrase Habakkuk. He says his world is so different when he was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Bad guys are losing now, and the good guys are losing, but the bad guys are winning.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to know what's going on, God. Where are you in all this? Why do you make my eyes see so much evil around me? God says to him, you don't know what I'm doing. You aren't aware of what I'm doing behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
If I told you, you still wouldn't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to believe that these changes I'm seeing in the world around me are going to be used by God in some way for his good.
Yeah.
And that keeps me going through it.
Yeah. The understanding that God is really in control. And sometimes we lose sight of that fact.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. How about any resources through your congregation where you're worshiping?
Well, what's been helpful to me is a series that our pastors have gone through the last month or so before Easter. And they talk about life being like a drive down a road. And as you're looking out the windshield in front of you, it's a wide perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You look in the rear view mirror, it's a very small picture.
Mm.
So they're saying to us, we spend more time looking ahead, less time looking back.
Mm.
That's been helpful to me.
Right.
I'm trying to adjust to the world around me and get used to it, and don't look so back. Don't look back so much.
Uh-huh.
That's been good for me.
Well, that's encouraging. And what word of encouragement will you have for others who are experiencing a variety of losses?
Just see God in it. Look for God in it somewhere. It may take time, but eventually God will come through and you'll see God in that thing.
We invite you now to hear more about support that can be provided through a church, as well as pursuing hope.
Sharon, you've had a lot of experiences over your life, and particularly in your ministry experience in local churches. And I know from conversing with you over time how you've helped so many people in processing the various losses that are a part of our lifelong process. So would you just give us some idea of what churches can really do to help people deal with these losses, which are certainly transitions in life that need to have somebody come alongside?
Well, I think the key is to realize that helping people deal with loss is not something you can program, but people come at loss obviously throughout their lifetime, but in different ways. And I think I've discovered that some people need just kind of a change of pace, where they're not focused all the time on their loss. Most of us need a smaller group that we can really confide in and talk about, particularly when we're going through a loss, and share our own experiences and hear from others so we know we're not alone. And in that process can sometimes get some help. And then I also think it's important that churches provide some kind of a one-to-one pairing of people who've perhaps been there, done that, or just somebody who is really trained as a compassionate listener and can move them forward. So I think we have to think about all three of those areas. I know I found, first of all, as you know, we have an active ministry at our church here in Roseville that we call Encore. And it's a peer group. It's a life stage group of basically adults who are 55 and older. And we've found that sometimes offering all kinds of programs, activities, but always with an emphasis on connecting and sharing stories is really helpful for people. So chances are anytime we gather for whatever the activity is, there are people who are experiencing either going into or in the midst of or coming out of a significant loss or changing life seasons or something like that. And I think when we're dealing with losses, it's important to have that wide circle, that broad circle of activity as well as conversation with people and the opportunity to meet new people.
Yes, and so the people that are involved in these, most of them have experienced some kind of a loss, so they can be able to share their experience and then be good listeners of the people who are currently going through maybe a fresh loss.
Exactly. Yeah. And that loss may relate to moving by choice into a new season or anticipating retirement or, you know, kids moving out of the house. I mean, there's just so many, or something even more significant, I think is important. So I think the peer group approach is very good. I recently spoke to a group of women at another church, actually. They have a ministry called Solo Sisters. And I think that's really good because, again, it's peers not necessarily talking about losses,
right,
but connecting, having fun together, laughing together, sharing life together. And so that as they do work through losses, they have that kind of support as well. So that would be the first thing that comes to my mind.
And what are some other groups that you mentioned? The Encore group, which is wonderful because we really are supportive of that. And it sounds as though it's been significant in your congregation. What are some other type groups that you have found have been helpful in helping people process losses?
Well, one of the things that we've found really helpful was the ministry called Rooted. And that's a small group ministry. Small groups in general can be helpful, but Rooted was particularly helpful, I think, for people going through loss and maybe not feeling connected in the church or in life or for whatever reason. And what I like best about the Rooted model is just the fact that it really gets people going deep together about spiritual truth, but also relationally. And so each person shares their story in a guided way, just doesn't get out of hand, but people are sharing stories and they may begin by thinking, there's nobody I can talk to about what I'm going through now. But through the Rooted process and sharing their own story and hearing others, they realize that we all experience losses, that we all experience changes, that we're all in the midst of loss and change pretty much all the time. And so people develop connections and relationships that are so important, especially in a time of loss. And my preference, although there are other ways of doing it, but my preference is to have even mixed generational groups. It can certainly be done with life stage groups, but I've seen the most benefit perhaps from people of different generations coming together, sharing their stories, being able to help one another through different transitions, and that often happen right in the midst of a Rooted 8-week experience or whatever, 10-week experience. And so yes, starting on and continuing on a path of discipleship, but also relational connections, I think is the key there. Although I do believe that groups such as a grief support group or something like that, when it's a small group, it's not overwhelming. It's not like our Encore group where there might be, 50 or 100 people there.
Right.
It's a small group that you can really continue, stay with, go close, not just study about stuff, but get to know each other.
Right. So you've mentioned some really significant things, such as Rooted and Encore and grief groups and one-on-ones, which are all very significant. Is there anything else that you would like to share to say, this is something else we found helpful?
Yeah, well, I didn't really say much about one-to-one. And again, my experience is primarily with Stephen Ministry, which is a one-to-one ministry for people going through a difficult time. And what I love about Stephen Ministry in particular, and I'm sure there are other programs as well, but it really equips people to be Stephen ministers. And they're not just sent out, then go meet with people and you're on your own now that you've been through the training, but it's intense training for 50 hours of training. And then beyond that, there's peer supervision, which I think is so important. So the people who are extending this one-to-one care are really in community themselves. They're practicing their skills. They
Right.
get supervision from their peers, excuse me, and so we're ensuring the very best care possible. But then for the person who's going through a loss or a difficult time, they're matched up with somebody who is a good fit for them. And it's somebody who can really come alongside them for the long haul. And so for many of us, we might need those other things, small groups and big groups, but
Right.
I think that one-to-one can often be the difference for people, where they can really hear themselves, talk out loud, get support without somebody trying to fix them. That kind of thing is just
Right.
huge. So that I definitely want to stress.
Hope is a powerful way of being. The power of having hope stimulates us into a willingness to move forward to a brighter tomorrow, to see the sun shine again, to even experience the lifting of the fog of despair and maybe some disconnection. Hope, it can exist in the middle of anxiety, even when we are in a hard place. Believers live with the hope of Jesus Christ, his return, and the joy of everlasting life. That is our hope, a life well lived in service to others. Philippians 2:4. When there is hope in the middle of pain, scripture assures us that weeping will last but a night, and joy will come in the morning. It is promised. Our Lord's compassions, they fail not. His faithfulness is new every morning. While holding on to hope, we see that the Lord is providing and paving a roadway in the deserts. He is giving us rivers of hope in our desert times and in the wilderness. What road are you traveling on today? Is it one of despair, disappointment, or disconnection? There is still time to take an on-ramp for greater hope, to be more towards a positive future, a promised future that Christ has given us. Hope is not merely wishing for something. Hope inspires our actions. It is the living hope that is anchored in the unchanging love and compassion and faithfulness of Jesus Christ. So refuse to give up your hope, even when the pressures of the world seems to be mounting. You can have your hope. You keep your hope. You seek that road that leads to peace, that leads to promise, that leads to new possibilities for the future. In Hebrews, believers are encouraged to hold on to hope. Hebrews 10:23-25 reads in the Amplified Version, "Let us seize and hold tightly the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is reliable and trustworthy and faithful to his word. And let us consider thoughtfully how we may encourage one another to love and to do good deeds, not forsaking our meeting together as believers for worship and instruction like some may do, but encouraging one another, and all the more faithfully as you see the day of Christ's return approaching." That's our call. Hold on to hope. Take that on road to hope. God bless.
Crescendo is here to support you. It is our intent to provide resources. We have a Crescendo app, which is really well done and full of resources. There's also Crescendo Facebook, and we would encourage you to check out those two resources. And then also feel free to contact any of us, because we are here to walk alongside, to bolster 60+ ministries by, with, and for older adults. Thank you for being with us today. And now may the God of hope fill us with all joy and peace, so that we might overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit for God's glory and people's good. Amen.